Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the planet. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. And yes, I'm back here in person. And we're joined, of course, with John Mackay, Diane and Sam Jenkins as well. Good to see you all. How are we all doing?
Well,
Thank
down
you.
under here in Australia, I'm doing all right. Sam, you doing okay?
I am doing well, thank you, John. How are you doing, Diane?
I'm well, thanks.
Any problems with the storm over there, you guys?
The winds are howling in the trees and it's blowing a mighty gale.
Now, listen, if we disappear during this program, there's 300,000 houses in the UK without power. We had a massive storm out here last night. 30,000 subscribers without power just in my town alone. 80,000 lightning strikes. So if we do disappear, you know what the cause is. So that's roughly what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And just here where we are, right? I'm in Norfolk, this program, and basically the next village or so along is completely without power. So we're just in the right little area to make sure we've still got it. But if I disappear, you know what the problem is. So keep praying. Hopefully we'll make it all the way through, which is great stuff. But let's start off then with some ministry updates. John, what have you been up to ministry-wise, and how are things going at your end?
Okay, well, at the personal level, last week I told you my wife had been into hospital for an emergency operation, removal of gallbladder, problems which had started at Christmas. So we've had a pretty rough start to the year. But the good news is I took a hand yesterday, got her out of bed, and she walked for the first time all by herself, and she didn't even seem to be drunk. I mean, they gave her one of those pain patches, the opioid pain patches to deal with the pain, because her gallbladder was gangrenous. Now, Diane might want to comment on that, but gangrene is not the sort of thing you want inside you. So they were very concerned about that. And the pain was enormous for the poor girl. But she had one of those pain patches, and I now understood why they had on the packet, don't drive while wearing one of these. She couldn't even drive up the hallway. But in reality, the good news was she walked for the first time all by herself, and she didn't fall over. So that's one thing we've been doing. The other thing we've been doing, and I'll talk about it a bit later, we've actually had a marvelous week with lovely rain and beautiful orchids. Oh, this one here is a miniature. I call them rat's tail orchids, and it's got a big brother, giants and miniatures. And Diane's going to be talking about those a little bit later. So we've had a marvelous flowering week of evidence. So that'll all be coming up. Climate change, giant size, years, all sorts of questions that have come in the past week. Diane, how's it gone for you?
Oh, well, I'm doing quite well. We've started sending out our email newsletters last week, and we've got a new feature that Joseph will tell us a little bit about, but we're making a little video to go with our newsletter, going over some of the items that are in that, looking at some of the science news things as well. So that's another option for catching up with what we're doing, and also what's being reported in the general scientific news, and how you can take a biblical perspective on it.
Well, let's talk about that straight away. So, yes, just as Diane mentioned, we last week filmed a whole program, which was great, and we've just we've been a little bit hectic, running all over the place here in the UK the last week or so, and there's been a number of major issues which have cropped up which needed dealing with. So we were slightly behind on getting this out, but it is going out tonight, after Creation Conversations is finished. So the plan is, moving forward, every single time we bring out a creation research evidence news or a newsletter or something like that, Diane and myself will go through it. We'll have a bit of a chat about some of the topics, look a little bit deeper, get some nice PowerPoint presentations up, and sort of do a news feature, a little bit more concise, or a little bit more, perhaps you could call it, not so much professional, but a little bit different, not quite as conversational as Creation Conversations is, but it's a nice way. It's going to be a bit shorter, so you'll be able to watch it and get all of the up-to-date news and information. Now, this week's one is going to be a little bit longer than future ones. That's just because this is the first one out this year. So there's extra content basically, but they'll come out every 2 to 3 weeks or so, basically whenever the evidence news comes out. So first and foremost, make sure you go and sign up to the evidence news. You will find links at the end of or in the description rather of the news broadcast, which is being shown this evening, and that will be going out about 11:30ish in the evening here in the UK, so about half an hour after 20 minutes to half an hour after Creation Conversations is finished. So that'll be doing a premiere, so go and check that out, go and watch that. We'll be monitoring the chat in that as well, so go and watch that. We've got a little clip to go out as well, but just a quick note about the way that it'll work. You will see in the description of the news feature when you go and watch it, not only do we have all of the references and all of the sources to all of the headlines that we talk about, you'll also find all of the featured questions on there. You'll find that all of the associated or recommended links to the fact file or useful links are all in the description as well. Options of how you can support the program and donate. You'll find all the different sort of links and sign up to the newsletter links, and everything is all there in the description. So you'll find that not only do you have the news broadcast itself, but also all of the details in the description, which will really help you as well. But let's just play a little sneak peek, a little preview of what is going to be coming up a little bit later. Hello and welcome to Creation Research News, a brand new broadcast from Creation Research. The headlines today: a rich diversity of fossils from the dead heart of Australia. Black box to record humanity's end. Keratin socks it to evolution. Giant millipedes once roamed northern England, and Darwin's abominable mystery solved yet again. So there we go. That will be coming up a little bit later. That will be premiering around 20 minutes to half an hour after Creation Conversation. So do be sure to go and watch and check that out as well. One last thing we'll do before I give my short little ministry update as well is please make sure you keep your questions coming in, because next week will be a Q&A special. So that's an entire program just dedicated to your questions and answers. So we will have a list of questions that you've asked us either in the comments of previous Creation Conversations or our YouTube videos. Any questions that you've put in the live chat that we didn't get round to, these are all kept, they're all collected up, and we'll do a special program next week just for the Q&A, plus obviously any other questions that crop up during our discussion. So it should be exciting. Join us for that as well. All right, a quick little ministry update for me and what I've been up to. I've been all over, and there's been some interesting things we've needed to try and deal with and sort out, but we think we're pretty much back on track, so pray much. In particular, pray for the museum project here in the UK. We've got a fabulous new addition to it. Let me just put this up on the screen here. Have a look at that. Our rule with Creation Research is that if I get something, then I have to make sure I get two of them so John can have one. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to get two of them, so John's feeling quite left out at the moment. But we've got a rather fabulous mosasaur skull. So you can see the eye socket there on the right-hand side of the photograph, and it's got a nasal cavity as well. The jaw is there. It's been the other side of the jaw has been pushed up underneath it, so it's a rather beautiful mosasaur skull. Mosasaur, by the way, was a sort of very large swimming marine reptile. They're often referred to as swimming dinosaurs, even though they're not technically dinosaurs by our definition, but great big sea dragons is basically what we're talking about. Now, if you watched my road trip and you watched some of the programs, you'll know that we went hunting for sea dragons, the ichthyosaurs and the plesiosaurs and the mosasaurs and the like, and you'll know that the reason why we called them sea dragons is because that's what they used to be called. And you can still go to the Natural History Museum in London, founded by Sir Richard Owen, who invented the name dinosaur in 1841, and you'll see up there on the great big plaques with all of these swimming dinosaurs, they have sea dragon written into them, because that's what they were called before and after the name dinosaur was actually coined. So these are the great big sea dragons. We've got a rather beautiful sea dragon now for our museum collection. Pretty much as we continue to try and develop this, all the collection is there on display. We're ready to receive visitors. We just need to finish some of the final details and negotiate some of the final contracts and stuff like that. So do pray much for that project and the future of it as well, because we'd love to get it ready to go. And you know, a note, and John, I might ask you to comment on this about as well, because this is one of the things that really drew me to creation research. And I know I've said it before, I'll carry on saying it again. One of the big things about creation research is that research element of it. And so whenever we take people to the museum, we always tell them two things, or I do anyway. This is a museum in the works, right? We're not completely ready yet, but also this is a working museum. So it will never be a sort of nice, snazzy, flashy, lots and lots of stuff. Nobody come in, nobody touch. We want stuff to be hands-on. We want stuff to be research oriented. So while a lot of our great big stuff is going to be obviously behind glass, you will always get an opportunity to come and touch and feel fossils for yourself, dig up fossils, and actually come and get involved with the research as well, and actually see the research for yourself and get involved with it. And that's basically what you've been able to do at Jurassic Ark as well, isn't it, John?
It certainly is. In fact, it's probably a good time to introduce a theme here that will show up a bit later because of one thing that fell from the sky this week. Let me show you. I have a bunya nut killer. Yep. We even put signs on these trees. Beware, this tree will kill you.
I've got my little one here.
Now, this is a pine cone, you know, the southern kauri type pines. And the interesting thing about it, remember the theme that we've taken all through the years is that God made everything very good. And I know that Shelley in Peace River in Alberta, who's freezing to death, is not in a good world. Yes, Shelley, I understand a nation, a country, a province that is a skating rink, because I was there one year and I looked out the window and the farmer had a thermometer on one of his outside poles and it said -30. Now, I'd never been in -30, not even in a freezer out here. And so I said, can I go outside and take a picture of how cold it is? So being an ignorant Australian who had no knowledge at all of climate at that extreme, I went outside, took my glove off, put my finger up against the thermometer, and that's where it stayed. Do you realize fingers freeze? And it just glued itself. I had to rip the skin off. So the one thing Shelley's praying for, and the one thing we've got evidence of, Shelley needs a climate change. Canada needs a climate change. These are evidence of it. I mean, look, this one here is where the nuts have started to show up. We eat these things, right? That's a bunya nut. And once a year, the Aboriginal people of Australia would sort of head towards the Bunya Mountains here in Queensland, and they would go crazy over sharing and buying and trading all of these beautiful bunya nuts, put all their squabbles aside for the sake of a good bit of tucker. Yep, tucker's an Aboriginal word, become Australian word. But the interesting thing is, when I was a student at university, the bunya nut, the Bunya Mountains, an exclusive sort of region where the bunya grows prolifically, was regarded as a remnant evidence of a previous better climate. And they don't grow in most of Australia now. But you do find fossil kauris, you do find the Araucaria trees in England. Isn't that true, Joseph?
Yeah, we call them monkey puzzle trees.
Yeah.
There's the varieties that do better here in the UK, because we're certainly not Australian tropical climate, right? The ones that do better here are the ones that come from the mountains of South America, and they're not quite as nice as your Australian ones, I have to say, because they're sort of very thick-leaved, they're very prickly, very, very spiky, and there's not a lot of diversity. I mean, they're still beautiful things, but the ones that I love are the ones that come from yours, like the Norfolk pines or the Bunya pines, and my favourite one of all time has got to be the Wollemi pine, which we've even managed to get some samples of here in the UK, and it does grow if you sort of look after it well and stop it from getting frosts and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, you've got some beautiful specimens of Wollemi pines, John. I know, not just as the actual trees, but also the fossils, because they're living fossils. They were the dinosaur tree, weren't they?
That's true. We're trading, because as soon as I get my ichthyosaur skull, you'll get your Wollemi fossil.
Absolutely.
That's for a deal. But you see, later on in the program, Diane's going to be talking about climate change related to age, related to biblical teaching, etc., what causes lifespans, etc. Because as a result of last week, remember we did time, days, etc., and the literality of Genesis. God made the world. He made it very good. He made it in 6 days. Someone came up and said, well, could the years before Noah's flood have been different? So they didn't actually live for 969 years. The year was a quarter of a fraction or a half of that. So they didn't live anywhere near as long. That's going to be my main theme. And Diane's going to take up some of the climate issues and some of the lifespan issues. Joseph, is it time to let Diane go on that one at the moment?
Well, I think just before we dive into that, I just wanted to, because you mentioned the question of time, right? And I've got an interesting set of things here, which I thought I'd bring up. You might recognize some of these, John, because they come from sort of your neck of the woods. In fact, we could talk about all sorts of stuff, including climate change of these, because these are the bleached skeletons of corals. Absolutely beautiful things. We've got beautiful examples. This came from a collection. A good friend of ours who sadly passed away a few years ago traveled all over the world collecting shells and corals and stuff, and they ended up donating them all to the museum. We've got a beautiful one there. I particularly like this one, the little branching coral. If we can hold that up, absolutely gorgeous. Now, John, with fossils, we were just talking before the program because we're talking about this question of time, right? Now, you know how you have your tree rings, and each ring is a lot of people instantly assume that one tree ring equals 1 year, but what it actually equals is one growing season. Is that correct? And
that's correct. And what's interesting, I went out just before the program and thought it would be great if I could bring a fossil specimen in here of one of these trees with their rings. And the nearest one was about that big. So I actually gave up on that thought for the moment. But what you find is the trees that come from Jurassic Ark, the Jurassic trees that we've got, mainly kauri pines, etc., the rings are very, very even. But in fossils like corals, I remember when I was a student at university, they were saying the corals had a total year of only 300 days based on their rings. Now, Joseph, you got hammered a bit with that at university too. What was the consensus by the time you finished your undergrad university stuff?
Well, it's quite. You can still see that kind of comment in what you might call layman literature or high school textbooks or sort of first year university textbooks. But really, by the time you get to sort of the research level, a lot of those ideas seem dubious at best. A lot of sort of the upper level professors will be like, oh well, you know, that's one idea, but it doesn't really hold up to proper scrutiny. And I think that's it's important when looking at this question of time to realize what we're really talking about, because in the case of trees, right, which everybody recognizes, here in the UK, one tree ring does mean 1 year, because we only have one growing season, right? It's spring and summer. That's just because of the way that we have our climate. But in places like Australia, I remember speaking to the guy who's Craig down in Tasmania, who's fully qualified in forestry, right? And you can have up to 4.
By the way, Joseph, he was
time.
the head of forestry in Tasmania for quite a while. So sorry to interrupt
John,
you.
I've lost you there for a second.
You have.
Say that again, sorry.
Craig was the head of forestry in terms of the field work. So he really has got qualifications in trees. Now continue on with the quote about what he was telling you.
He really, really has. And he was saying, you can observe, because you've got optimal growing conditions, essentially, you can have up to 4 rings grow in a single year. Now, that really shows you that the ring is actually a growth period, because it just so happens in optimal conditions, you can have 2, 3, 4 growing periods within 365 day period, right? As opposed to here in the UK. So you've got to realize what you're actually looking at when you're looking at these measurements of time, and B, you've got to realize that these measurements of time can actually fluctuate, but in terms of their growth, right? But time itself, and I think you're going to speak about that a little bit more, John. Just because you've got 4 times as many rings doesn't mean it lived for 4 times as long. And it works the other way around as well, because you can have some places where it takes a very long time to produce a ring. So it's an interesting thought and an interesting sort of look into the way that science is perceived, you still see this being pushed in the layman's level and the sort of the high school level. By the time you get to the research level, it's sort of ignored at best, or viewed as sort of dubious at the most. So it's an interesting look.
Well, we have in the Northern Territory, you've only just been there when I let you loose on Ayers Rock or Uluru, right? Remember that? Hardly any trees in the desert area, stunted little scrubby stuff. And sometimes it doesn't rain for 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
Well, the thing we've noticed is that in a good wet season, maybe 2 wet seasons, 3 wet seasons a year, you'll get 3 sets of rings. But in a time when there's no rain for 10 years, a tree ring does not equal 1 year. You will not get any new growth until you get a new wet season. So be very careful out there when they're telling you about climate, years, and tree rings. It simply does not add up at all. It indicates what the climate has been like far more than it indicates the time that's gone past.
Anything else? Yeah, good comment. All right, then, Diane, over to you. Let's do your little bit, talking about lifespans in Genesis and some of the sort of biology, I believe. Is that right?
Yes. It's interesting how people try to avoid the time that's given in the Bible for things to happen, and for particularly for these long lifespans in Genesis. Everyone wants to bow down to what the scientists and the secular media say about time, and ignore what the Bible says about time. And here's just one little example relating to those long lifespans in Genesis. Now, a lot of people just gloss over those and ignore them, and some people have tried to explain them away. So let's not ignore them. Let's just have a look at them. And so if we go to the slides here, if you look at the Genesis lifespans, and you can excuse me, you can actually plot them all out. There is enough information there, and we can go all the way from Adam, and this is just a graph of all of the total lifespan of each person who's named there, starting from Adam. And there is enough data if you look through Genesis and then into Exodus. You have enough data to go from Adam to Moses, and the last plot on that graph is actually Psalm 90, which was written by Moses. And if you look at the scale there, Psalm 90 refers to the lifespan of people as being 70 to 80 years. But if we go back to Adam and his immediate descendants, we've got 10 times that, or even more. It sort of bumps along there at over 900. The longest one, as John mentioned before, was 969, Methuselah. And then a couple of generations after, it seems to just sort of fall over a cliff, doesn't it? Something has happened there. So there's certainly been significant change in the lifespans, and there's certainly something significantly different in the time that Adam and his immediate descendants lived compared with the time that we live. And that is what we see in those things in the fossil record that we've mentioned so far this morning. So what happened when it looks like things fell over a cliff there, which is in between the time of Noah and Shem? Well, of course, that is the time of Noah's flood. Noah spent a little bit more than half his life before the flood, and then lived for a few centuries afterwards. And Shem was born before the flood, but he didn't live nearly as long after the flood. So there's a significant change there. So something must have happened to the whole world to make enough difference to the human lifespans. Now, I have had this question thrown at me, and I know that John has as well. Oh, well, maybe those large numbers don't mean years. Maybe they mean months. Actually, there's a really interesting way to answer that, because we are given the ages of each person, or each person named there, how old they were when their sons were born, when the next son in the sequence was born. Now, if you look at all of those, starting Adam, 130, and remember that wasn't his first son. That's actually Seth when he was born. And each of these named persons in the next generation is the one who was the line of the genealogy, which eventually leads to Christ, of course. But that wasn't necessarily the first born child of that family. But even if it was, it doesn't make any sense if these only mean months, because if you look further down a little bit in that in the list there, you've got 70 years, 65 years. Now, if you divide that by 12, you get a rather silly answer for when that man could father a child. So we'll dismiss that quite simply. And this is a good indication of, if you actually know what the scriptures say, you can answer a lot of the skeptics' challenges, because a lot of the skeptics don't know what scripture says. And of course, the other thing is, just don't be afraid to check out the science. So let's go back to these lifespans. Now, there is one anomaly in the pre-flood lifespans here, and that's Enoch, who seemed to live a significantly shorter lifespan. And again, that is also explained in the scriptures. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Whereas all of the other people described there, it says they died. And then later on, we're told in the book of Hebrews that Enoch walked with God by faith, right? And God took him, and he didn't die. So he is an anomaly there, but that's not to do with the total lifespan of the people who lived in that pre-flood time. So the real change there is something changed in the whole world before the flood and after the flood. Something really significant happened that resulted in a shorter lifespan. Now, there are all sorts of things that result in shorter lifespans, and we can talk about some of those. But if you think about, the world degenerated very much there. The whole environment degenerated, the climate degenerated. In fact, Noah was warned about that. Even though there will be regular cycles of day and night and harvest and seed time, there will be periods of heat and cold. And John, you've described some of the the serious cold that you get in some places, and we know that that does have an impact on people's lifespans if they are constantly stressed by severe cold and they have no way of keeping themselves warm artificially. Our diet changed by permission from God. We were allowed to eat meat. Well, why was that? Well, obviously there would be places that God knew where you couldn't eat a vegetarian diet all the year round, because it just wasn't available. So the climate, the environment went severely downhill, and as a result, the lifespans went downhill. So they are an indicator that something has seriously changed in the world after Noah's flood. And some of those things that we see in the fossil record, where there are big animals like the mosasaur that Joseph has just shown us, that no longer exist. So there has been a lot of change in the world since it began, but it's not to do with millions of years of endless cycles and slow gradual processes. It's often catastrophic processes, Noah's flood being the main one of those, but other catastrophic processes. And in general, the history of the world, as we have said, is from very good, when everything was finished by God. It's gone from good to bad to worse to where we are now in the UK and Australia and beyond. And so if we can go back to us now, we've got some other interesting things to talk about in the light of what the Bible tells us about how things have changed over the years.
Okay, just to throw in one there that's related. Remember my bunya nut? Now you have to peel this stuff off. That's not a too edible spike at the end, right? So you peel this off and you crack this open, and there's a little seed inside there. Now, if you want to cook it, it's sort of got a floury type taste with a bit of a a piney flavour, and just a unique bunya sort of taste. You can make it as a flour, you can cook with it, you can use it to thicken things. But what's interesting is we grow these things here in Queensland. They're in abundance in the Bunya Mountains, which, as I said, as a student, they told me it was evidence the climate had been universally better across Australia. And we do find them in the rocks at Jurassic Ark, but they are much bigger. They're sort of, that's the difference. By the way, I would hate to have one of those bunya nuts fall on my head. And I'm not kidding. If you go to the Bunya National Park, there are signs, beware, these trees can kill you. They really can. Even the
yes, I've seen those in the Brisbane Botanic Gardens as well.
If that falls on your head, you are one dead nut for sure. So we do have evidence in the food levels that the food quantity and availability has actually changed. So don't be surprised that God gives us changed rules after the flood. Jurassic Ark, we treat it as a flood deposit because it's full of the Araucaria, the southern conifers, the group containing the bunya ones. They are all flood deposited there. So there is evidence of flooding. There is evidence of change in climate. There is evidence of diminishing size. That's the word I'm trying to look for, even in the fruits that are and were available. Okay, now secondarily, there's another aspect that Diane might want to take up after, because we've had a wonderful, it's the end of summer over here. So some of the plants that are a little more fragile, some of my orchids are doing very well. And in this last week, look at this one that's come out. Oh, and by the way, I spot George there on the side. Commendations to you, George, because after watching us for ages, knowing us for a long time, you finally signed up to get our regular publication. So encourage all your friends. In fact, Sam put up a message as to how they can actually subscribe, because that's what we're after. And thanks to those of you who are giving donations. Don't forget to send in your questions. But did you notice that orchid is mostly green? Green petals. If you didn't, because most people look, but very few people see. Look at that. I've got to get this right. Look at that. Isn't that a pretty color? Green petals with a lovely white and red inside. Now, most people just notice the prettiness, but they don't notice some of the things that Charles Darwin noticed. And this is not just related to pretty, not just related to orchids, it's related to time for creation. Now, can you spot those little orchids there? Diane, you like orchids. What are these ones called?
And these are Catasetum, and because it's got a sort of fringe around the outside, it's called Catasetum fimbriatum, which means fringed Catasetum.
Yeah, fringe or bearded Catasetum for sure.
Yes.
Now, Charles Darwin is famous for his studies of these in South America. I guess you don't know that Charles Darwin wrote a whole book on British and foreign orchids. Yes, it's not a bestseller, but it's still available, and it's quite an authoritative one, because he concentrated on the actual way the orchids are pollinated. But that's our clue for today. You see, this orchid here is pollinated by a euglossid bee. And well, Diane, while I hold it up, you comment on the structure there, and I'll then comment on the time. Can we see that in focus? Yes, we can. There we are. All right. Okay, so how's this one pollinated, Diane? You can see it there on the right-hand side as I hold it up. There's a tiny little spike coming out. Now, Diane, take it away.
Yes, that tiny little spike, which is hard to see with the sort of camera we've got here, but maybe we could put up some photos of that. This flower is not particularly colourful or bright, so you wonder how on earth does it attract its pollinators. They are attracted by fragrance, but once they get there, orchid pollen is packaged in little clumps, and you have to actually the flower has to attach those little clumps to the back of the bee. Now, this flower has the most wonderful way of doing. The little spike that John referred to is actually a trigger. And as the bee moves around inside that flower, when it's just in the right place with its back in the right place, it will actually knock that trigger, and it's spring loaded. So this has to be set up before the bee arrives. This whole thing is spring loaded, and it will literally shoot the pollinia, that's the little clumps of pollen, onto the back of the bee. And the bee will then fly away. Fortunately, it can't reach the back of the middle of its back, so it can't scratch them off. And it will be attracted to another one of those plants, but it will have different flowers. It's an interesting plant. It has male and female flowers, which are very different. But so what John held up were the male flowers, and the bee is literally shot in the back by the flower. Now, Charles Darwin studied some of these. People sent him plants from all over the world, and he had lovely big greenhouses in his property, his garden, and he studied these, and he discovered this trigger mechanism, and he wrote about it to one of his friends, Huxley, who was one of his loudest proponents. In fact, Darwin was a quiet man and sort of stayed out in the country, but his friend Huxley was a much more dominant sort of personality, and he promoted Darwin's theory. So Darwin would describe things to him, and he described this to Huxley. And he wrote in one of his other letters, I carefully described the shooting out of the pollinia of the catasetum, and I received from an answer, do you really expect me to believe all of that? Now,
it's certainly true that Huxley, the greatest doubter, the biggest opponent of Christianity, had struggles with what Darwin was telling him, because if you can imagine, and this is related to the time issue, the time of creation and how long you've got to evolve a pollinated system. Huxley wants evolution to be true. Darwin has just provided one of the best evidences of God's genius of design, and the fact that this flower is designed to actually take a bee, which comes in, crawls around the trigger. It's sometimes known as a six-gun orchid, bang, and then the bee will fall backwards, hit the trigger, and it gets shot in the middle of the back, and the flower never misses. Think carefully. When was the last time you went bee shooting with a six-gun and you shot it right in the middle of the back? That is brilliant engineering. But if you also want to think about it, how long have you got to evolve a mechanism like that? And the answer is the point that Diane makes over and over again. You've got to have it done quickly, or you'll never have it done at all. And the fact is, the male orchid, and this orchid is very, very unusual, the male orchid is different from the female orchid. And when the bee is sick and tired of being shot in the back, he tries to find a female orchid, and he just walks demurely inside, no problems, until the orchid just goes snap and pinches the pollen off its back. And God's got a brilliant sense of humor, but there's the first point of Diane's graph. Everything's made in 6 days. Everything was very good. The orchids are over and done with on the 3rd day of creation. The design is there. So when the bees come on the 5th and 6th days of creation, it all fits together. Time is your enemy. Time is not your friend. So at the start of creation, the point we dealt with over and over again, you can't take a vast amount of time. Now that gave rise to our question that came in as a result of last week. Can the years have been different? Diane did months. Diane, do we have that question fully explained on our Ask site? The one about
yes,
the months?
there is a question about how could people live so long on the Ask site. So you can just look that up. Look up lifespans or lifespan or Genesis lifespan, and you'll find it there.
I will make sure that link goes on the description of this Creation Conversations video. I normally try and put a related question into the description. I don't think I did this time, but I'll get that and make sure that goes in there before the end of today, basically. So.
Okay, and thank you, Shelley, for your information about Irish green flowers. We have another one in Australia called a green hood orchid. I've never seen the Irish one. I'll have to look it up one day when I'm there. There was an Irish nurse in hospital with my wife looking after her. She did a wonderful job, and she came from Donegal and still had an accent as strong as an Irish sort of beer. So you'll find that she would have been familiar with this. I'll look it up and see what I can find about it. But all of these pollination mechanisms, which fit in the first 6 days of creation, have to be over and done with, and time is your enemy. So if you want to look up the question about months and creation and months and ages, it's on the Ask site, and we'd encourage you to look at it. Now, coming up in a moment, and I suspect we probably need a question time coming up. If there are questions, I'm going to read the Bible verse that's related to this person's question about could the years have been different. If you look at your Bible, the first reference to days is in Genesis. In fact, it's the first measure of time God gives us, and the only one he defines. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were day one. Or if you're English, the first day, but it really says day one in the Hebrew. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. He's defining it. He's inventing the word. They were day one. But the first reference to years and months are in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11. It's about Noah, in that point where Diane's graph sort of changed lengths. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, and that same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. As I love to tell people, if you ask them, how old was Noah when the flood started? They'll say 600. No. Listen, it says in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month. He was 600 years, 2 months, and 17 days. You may not realize it, but the year of Noah's flood is the most precisely recorded, the most chronologically differentiated year in the whole of the Old Testament. There is precision here. This is not just a once upon a time, Noah built a boat, and then he took all the guinea pigs and the kangaroos and he put them on board. No. This is a very precise chronology. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of month, on that same day, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, we'll take a little bit of a break and see if there's any questions coming in from what we've said so far. Then I'll proceed with some teaching on, was the year different? Was the month different? We know one thing, the day is defined by God, month and year. Where do they come from? Well, we'll come back to that. Sam, do we have any questions coming in at the moment?
Well, we had a question last week that I did promise that we would answer first of all. So we will we'll do that first. So this came from Michael Hu. What's your view on pets in the new earth? I've had some that were very dear to me and my family.
Go on, Joseph, you're a zoologist. You're the man who runs the zoo. Will there be zoos in the new heavens and new earth? Will we need bars on the cages? Will there be snakes from Australia who... Go ahead.
All right. First comment, because you can sort of deal with this in two parts. We'll deal with are there going to be animals in heaven? And it would certainly imply that there are going to be. References from the Psalms talk about the wolf and the lamb and the viper, which can play with, the child can play with the viper and it doesn't hurt him. So there's two things you can get out of that. Number one, yes, there are likely to be animals in heaven, in the new heavens and the new earth. They're likely to be similar to the animals that we have on earth today, although whether they'll be the original created kind, who knows? God does. It's his plan and he will orchestrate it. And the key thing there is that the children will be able to play with the vipers. And the lamb can lay down next to the wolf and there won't be an issue. And something that I like to remind people, because I have whole programs, right, on what's the origin of venom, what's the origin of poison, what's the origin of sharp teeth. And the thing I like to remind people is nowhere in scripture do you have any reference to the angels going around filing down the wolf or the lion's teeth, right, or clipping off the viper's fangs. So one thing you've got to remember is in a very good world, not only do you have creatures with sharp teeth and venom and poison, but they're all being used for good purposes. And yes, go back and watch our whole program on venom and poison and everything else if you want to find out more about that. It's a good creation with a good created purpose now being used in a bad way, and there's plenty of evidence for that. So yes, it would certainly seem that there's going to be animals in the new heaven and the new earth. Yes, it would certainly seem that they are going to be good, as the new heavens and the new earth are going to be, right? A reflection of that original creation will be in our glorified bodies, and the animals will not be, vicious, horrible. Let's use our good design in a bad way. They're going to be using their good design in the good way, right? Okay, what about pets, as in pets that we've kept in this lifetime? Will they be in the new heavens and the new earth? Well, I'll get John to comment a little bit further as deeper spiritual things, but one thing to remember is Paul talks about over and over again the different types of flesh. There's one flesh of man, there's one flesh of the animals. There's one flesh of man, there's one flesh of the birds, there's one flesh of the seas, there's one flesh of the beasts of the land. We do have a whole program about animal rights. And there's a difference because only mankind was made in the image of God. The local chimpanzee in your local zoo was not made in the image of God. We were made in the image of God, and being made in the image of God is important because only descendants of the first man who was ever created in the image of God is able to be saved. Only descendants of Adam can be saved, and in our state today, we're no longer in the perfect image of God. We're in a fallen, corrupt image, right? So only descendants of Adam can be saved, the original one who was made in the perfect image of God, and no other animal was made in his image. That's why it's so important that Jesus was a descendant from Adam. That's why you've got all of that genealogy there, right? Because it proves that Jesus Christ really can be our Redeemer, because there's laws of redemption laws, right, in Leviticus saying you have to be related to the person who you're redeeming. It's really important that Jesus Christ is not only perfect, that he's not only 100% God, but also that he's 100% man and 100% legitimately descended from Adam. It's all extremely important to have those things together if Jesus Christ is going to be able to save us. Seeing as salvation was only ever intended for mankind, seeing as salvation can only come to those who are legitimately descended from Adam, I do not think that pets like your cat and beloved cat and dog will be in the new heavens and the new earth in themselves. John, any comments from that?
Yes, and then I'll get Diane to make a comment on lifespan and size in the pre-flood world. I remember when my mum, bless her heart, turned 60 years of age. We kids decided we would give her a birthday cake with 60 candles. Now, there's several lessons I learned about that. One was why scientists use candle power as a measure. Would you believe we melted the entire icing right off the top of the cake and nearly set the house on fire, as it were? You can't put 60 candles on a cake and light them all. It's just an impossibility. But it also reminded me of a habit that many of us have, like, have you got relatives who've died? Did they die 4 years ago? Are they now 4 years older? Do you wish them happy birthday in heaven? Well, in the new heavens and the new earth, the thing that you and I call time is totally different. So there is no sun. Remember the book of Revelations? There will be no sun there because he will be our light. We will not require what you and I call sun. If we don't have a son, how much older are you every year? What happens to years? All good questions. But in reality, you will find that little Tim, little Tom, little dog, little whatever, do not get to be 1 year older as you get to be 1 year older. I mean, think of how boring it would be. You know that song, after 10,000 years in heaven, we'll praise him just the same. Well, will you have a 10,000th year birthday? How boring. I've had 9,990. I don't want another one, right? You won't have that concept. So there is a lot of changes, and I'm pretty sure pets is one of them. And I'll give you an example of a brilliant Sunday school teacher, dear old lady who had all the wisdom of God, who was asked by little Johnny, "Excuse me, miss, my puppy dog has died. Will it be in heaven when I get there?" And she very wisely said, Jesus knows that if you need your little puppy dog to make you happy in heaven, it will be there. Now you realize how brilliant that answer is? Because
I like
when
that.
you get to be with the Lord, everything is coming from him. Here's your source of happiness. You don't need a birthday party to remind you've had another year, you've endured the government, more taxes you've paid. You don't need to be reminded. None of those things will be there. But the one thing that is interesting, in our world, many creatures that keep growing as long as they live sometimes live a long time. Crocodiles 100 years of age are bigger than crocodiles who are 20 years of age. Turtles who are 400 are bigger than turtles that are 100. Diane, in your graph, comment on the relationship of the size of creatures. And in fact, George Bond just put up something about carbon-14 we might want to come back to in terms of age. But Diane, tell us about size and longevity before the flood.
Well, certainly there are some animals. You mentioned crocodiles. This happens with fish. It does happen with other land reptiles as well. Whales and marine animals will keep growing as long as they live. Now, not always at the same rate. They do have a growth spurt earlier in their life and then it slows down. But as long as they are in an environment where there is a sort of uniform, mild environment throughout the whole year, where there is good, nutritious food, where they are not diseased and they are not stressed. Now, we don't get that combination of conditions very often in this world, in fact, very rarely, and certainly no disease and no stress, that doesn't happen in this world. It will in heaven. So, yes, there are some animals which can keep growing every day of their life. Now, if people lived for long periods of time, probably animals did as well before the flood. So imagine the crocodiles, and the fossil record actually confirms this. The fossil crocodiles are bigger than the ones that we have in Australia now. So yes, animals that are capable of growing all their lives, and they have to have the right sort of physiology and structure to do this. If they are in the right environment, which means all of those perfect things, they will keep growing. So imagine your 900-year-old man with his pet dinosaur. How big was that if it had kept growing for 900 years, if it started out life at the beginning of that person's lifespan? So that would certainly account for some of the giant animals and other giant things that we find in the fossil record that no longer exist at all today, or that are represented by much smaller examples, much tinier examples. So there has not only been a shrinkage in lifespans, there's been a shrinkage in the physical bodies of a lot of creatures, and some of them have sadly disappeared completely.
Okay, to add to that, remember I brought you up my little rat's tail orchid? Now, that's the little brother, a mutation of the big rat's tail orchid. I mean, I guess you've probably never seen a rat's tail orchid, but they are fantastic. But the size is governed not just by the climate, because these two grow in the same climate, except one of them, the tiny one, is a mutation. Just like that animal that's trying to get on the screen with Sam there. I mean, hold it up, Sam. This muted cat animal that, I mean, if you wanted it to grow 1,000 years and it grew every day of its life, that would be an impossibility. So if you think carefully, one reason there's no time as you and I know it in the eternal side of things is the pussycats. Yes, Joseph says there's going to be animals, whether they're pets or not, that'll be a monster, just like some of the big tigers and that are today. Thanks, Sam. You've given the cat enough airtime there. That's great. Okay, so there's one other thing that George brought up before. George asked about carbon-14 and lifespan. Now, I do have to comment on this. And if there's no more questions after that, you have a look and tell me if I'm right or wrong, Sam. When I went to visit one professor in Canada, I passed a carbon-14 dating laboratory. And on the outside was warning, when you enter this laboratory, wear your protective face gear, right? Carbon-14, absolutely harmless on your skin. Radiation so weak, it won't penetrate your skin. Your skin is already dead. That's why it doesn't matter. But inside your lungs, you have live tissue. Breathing lots of carbon-14 in, carbon-14 out actually can kill you. One of my friends was one of the senior doctors involved in Chernobyl. And what he was telling us was the lifespan of the kids has been affected by the amount of radiation they're exposed to. So you will find that you increase the short wavelength radiation, any dangerous radiation, which is one thing that would have happened after Noah's flood. And it helps us understand, okay, 900, plunge down to where we are now, a new stable. If we get more radiation, don't be surprised, post-flood, it will also start to do that, just like it's done locally at places like Chernobyl. Sad, but it's true. Our lifespan is not just determined by genetics. Our size is not just determined by genetics, but the hazards of the environment add to that picture, and it's not a good picture. That's why Joseph and I and Sam and Diane are so enthused about fixing up the real problem, which is not the government, which is not, diseases, which is not the environment. The real problem is something inside called sin, and only Jesus Christ can give you back that eternal life in the new heavens and the new earth. Sam, is there any other questions that have come up?
I think that there are
yes,
a few more
do.
questions. My suggestion would be that my suggestion would be that we move on to the next part. We're sort of an hour in. I suggest we move on to the next part, and then we know how much time we've got basically left for questions. Obviously, we've got our special Q&A broadcast coming next week. So anything we don't get to today, we will come round to next week. There's actually about 3 questions come in, including a 2-parter from Neil. So we will let's deal with them as we go on. Any other questions, of course, keep them coming, because like I say, if we don't get to them today, we have an entire program dedicated to questions next week, as we do at the end of every sort of spell of creation conversation. So keep the questions coming. John, over to you for the next bit then.
Okay, back to Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Environmental change, it was a climate change beyond a shadow of a doubt. It had never rained. Genesis chapter 2 is emphatic. There was no rain on the planet Earth. The whole world was watered by a mist. No wonder the plants and the animals loved that and did so well. So the first time it mentions rain is in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11 and 12. And it's specific that Noah was 600 years, 2 months, and 17 days. So one thing is that a month has more than 17 days. Otherwise, it would have said 2 months, 3 months. A month must be longer than 17 days. So here we have, for the first time in Scripture, a use of the word year. Now, you can look up in Hebrew, you can look up the origin of the word year in English, which is related to German, which goes all the way back to proto, the Indian sort of language, and you'll find it refers to changeover, refers to a way of measuring changeover. Okay, but what's interesting is the word month does the same. When you have a look at the month, actually the word is originated from the word moon. Every month. You get full moon, then part moon, then you get a new moon. And then it goes all over again. It goes in 30 days approximately. So your month or your month is a measurement of time. We've invented the words. We invented the word year. God invented the word day. So in all of these time measurements here, we have one word which is defined by God. The rest are defined by us. Now, in terms of asking when would these words have come into existence, we've got the answer to one of those. And the answer is Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were day 1. I stress that because if you say first day, it's because the English really can't deal with the concept of day 1 followed by second day, but it actually is day 1. This not is just day 1, but it's literally one day. So Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5 is a definition of the day, and God sticks to it. The only time period that's absolutely defined is light, dark. And then there was a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and a seventh. It's a literal period defined by God, and you can see what it means when God gave the people of Israel an actual rule about it. 6 days, 6 periods of light, 6 periods of darkness. A first one, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth will be followed by a 7th day, on which you will rest. Then it will start all over again. So if you want to know what the meaning is, go to Israel, grab a rabbi, ask him which day is his Sabbath, which day is his seventh, which day is his day of rest, and he'll tell you from Friday night sunset to Saturday night sunset. Where do you get that concept from? And the evening and the morning. So the Israeli calendar, the Jewish Orthodox calendar, is based on Genesis chapter 1, verses 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So day is an absolute definition. Month and year. We do know they're used here, but of course the question is, how did we get Genesis? As far as everyone can tell, Moses is used by God. Adam did not know the world was made in 6 days. I hate to tell you that, but in reality, the only things Adam knew by experience, he was made sometime in the morning of the 6th day, probably before the coffee break, right? And then God made a garden and put him in it. Implication, Adam was outside of the garden. So he knew something about outside of the garden and inside of the garden. And when he was in there, he got all the animals and he named the ones. All the animals are brought to him by God, and he must be a pretty good, he must have a brilliant memory. He remembered the name of the first one, the aardvark, before he got up to number 17,826, the zebra. Now, that's what you call good memory. My memory's not that good. I can remember scriptures, I can remember lots of numbers and files, but not as good as Adam could have. Okay, then Adam was put to sleep. So he didn't even know where Eve came from. What he knew was that she wasn't there when he was awake, and she was there when he was asleep. And he comes out with some information about bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. So he had an innate knowledge somehow that this woman is part of him. All right, now, where did he get the words from? They must have been given to him by God. But there's no evidence that he knew on day 3, God made the plants. There's no evidence he knew on day 4, God made the sun and moon and the stars. And when God defines the day, at the end of the 6th day, you will find that God does not make no reference to the sun at all. He makes a reference to the first day, and he makes a reference to the light that he made before the sun. So time is not solar, time is, it's daily, the way God defined it. So day is defined in this verse here. Go back to Genesis 1. Year and month. As far as we can see, Moses was the one who was up there on Mount Sinai and given them the information. I made the world in 6 days. I rested on the 7th, therefore you'll do the same. Our information about Genesis is maybe added to by Mr. Moses, courtesy of God. So Genesis chapter 1, verses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right up to verse 26 are revelation, and there's nothing else they could be. No scientist can conclude all the stuff that's in Genesis chapter 1. Adam couldn't have concluded. He might have guessed at it, but he wouldn't know if he was right or wrong. God is the revealer of the true time involved in creation. Okay, month. Once God has made the moon, the sun, the moon, and the stars, you and I can use our God-given brains, because we do need to, actually, if you notice how important time is to you, I mean, what day of the week is it? You're important. What day of the month is it? We notice that the moon keeps going around, and every 30 days, actually to be precise, every 29 and a half days, it's back in the same place. And if you did that experiment at school, you got a pencil, you marked the window ledge, and you waited till the shadow came back to that spot, and it'll be 365 and a quarter days from the very moment that you actually put that mark in. And so you actually have a time scale called a year. So the question is, could the years have been different before Noah's flood? Let's help us, because if you keep going through Genesis, you find another reference to days and months and years, and you find it in Genesis chapter 8 at the finish of the flood. Let me read it to you. Genesis chapter 8, verse 13, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth. Okay, so by that time, Noah's not out. The ark has landed on the mountains. It's been there for a couple of months waiting. Yeah, you probably didn't notice that bit about Noah's flood, but they actually landed well before they could get off. I suspect it's so that God would give the grass time to come back. And yes, We know that Noah didn't have to collect all the grass seeds, because we observe in Australia, a dam gets full for 10 years, 20 years, then there's a drought and there's no water in the dam for 5 years. But as soon as the dry ground is exposed, up comes the grass from the bottom. The seeds have been there and they close themselves down and they produce grass after a couple of weeks of the ground reaching the right saturation level. Okay, so in the 600th year and the first year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth. Now, if you bother reading from Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, to Genesis chapter 8 and verse 13, you'll find references to second month, third month, fourth month, fifth month. You'll find that Noah's year, between Genesis chapter 7 and Genesis chapter 8, there are 10 names or 10 times of months mentioned. And what you learn about this one, it says on the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth. He looked around, and behold, the face of the ground was now dry. And in the second month, on the 7th and 27th day of the month, the earth was fully dry. Okay, did you catch that? There's 27 days now mentioned in that month. So you know one thing, the month in Noah's day was longer than 27 days. Don't be surprised, the moon hasn't changed. The month is still roughly 29 and a half days. Okay, so what you find is that all the evidence, both from Noah and from Moses and from every ancient society we got post-flood, is that the month has been a fairly regular 30-day event. Now stop and think. In the first part, the reference to Noah, he's there on the first month and the 17th day of the month. The flood finishes in the second month on the 27th day of the month. So one thing you know is that Noah was in the ark for 1 year and 10 days. Wow, Joseph would have loved that, locked up with a zoo. I personally suspect all the animals went to sleep and they didn't grow during that period of hibernation. Interesting thought. Joseph may want to pursue that. Here's what the problem is. The person who says the years could have been different, bless their heart, because they're trying to deal with a problem of, okay, you've got long ages. People regard it as being 900. If you just make those months, it doesn't make any sense, particularly if you take Enoch, who would have been 12 when he had his first kid on that basis. You can remove all of that totally. When you look at the average age of people having their kids before the flood, what were they? The least was about 100. Perhaps they didn't become teenagers till 100. What a thought. Kids, teenagers for 100 years. I won't pursue that one, but perhaps it's really true. But after the flood, their lifespan gets less and less and less. So were the years any different? The one thing we do know for sure, the day was exactly the same. The one thing we do know for sure, the time being recorded here starts before the flood and uses exactly the same time parameters to measure the end of the flood. It gives you the minimum number of days in a month as 27, which means it was pretty close to what we have, even if you don't have the extra information of the month being 29 and a half days. So all the evidence we've got from days and months is the time being referred to before Noah's flood and the time being referred to after Noah's flood are exactly the same. So don't be surprised. Joseph, remember Joseph? Taken a prisoner and sold by his brothers to Pharaoh. You read in the Bible that his dad turns up in Egypt. There's a drought over there in Canaan. They're in terrible trouble and they come for help. And dad and the brothers don't actually know who Joseph is. I mean, he's the prime minister of Egypt. He's a pretty impressive guy. Probably got all his black eyebrow stuff on and dressed in Egyptian clothes. Unrecognizable after many years to dad and his brothers. But once the introduction has occurred, Joseph's dad says, there was a time when my ancestors lived far longer than we live today. A comment that doesn't make any sense unless Genesis is literally true. Far longer, 900 years, 969 years after the flood. Noah is the last person to live over 900. And he lived before and after the flood. Shem lived 100 years before the flood. Makes no sense if you change it to months, and then all of a sudden through the flood, the years become more and more normal. By the time you get down to our Faxad, he's only living 600 years. Then Abraham, 175. Then Moses, he's a pretty old guy at 120, but you see, God puts him to death because he wasn't allowed to enter the promised land. He disobeyed God, and the wages of sin is death. Even though Moses' sin would have been trivial in our eyes. I mean, he spoke to the rock and was supposed to bring forth water. Instead, he lost his temper with the people of Israel and he smashed the rock. God didn't tell him to do that. The wages of sin is death. What's sin? Anything you do that God told you not to do. You'll find that a really interesting study. There is no evidence in the Bible of time measurement being changed before the flood or time measurement being changed after the flood. And the definition of time by God is the one he sticks to. He defined the first day, or not just the first day, he defined day one. Look up the word in scripture, look it up in Hebrew. It's not the first day, it's not just day one, it is one day. Absolutely important that you get to know that. Okay, I think that's probably as much as we need to say on that for the moment. And we'll go back to Joseph. You got any questions on that one or comments? And Diane.
I think that the only comment I say is, this was something that we went through together, John, when I was sort of still in training for creation research, when we traveled to Australia, and we do a Bible study most mornings, and we went through this, and it's stuff that's so blatantly obvious, but stuff that is hardly talked about now, because Genesis is now seen as this kind of, mythological concept. Shove it to one side, it's not really important. And yet it isn't just the foundation of the gospel and the foundation of the rest of scripture. It fully intertwines into everything. And so that's one of the reasons why we do the kind of work that we do. And I think that's probably a good point where we can sneak a commercial in for walking through Genesis with Jesus, or walking with Jesus through Genesis, whichever one it is. I normally end up saying walking through Jesus, which isn't right at all. But it's really the devotional book which deals from day 1 to 3, so we don't even get much past let there be light. But it's so important to recognize, and I think it's there we go, Sam, excellent. Walking with Jesus through Genesis. It's well worth going through the devotional, and it's something that we could almost do a whole series on. We're still looking to do an additional broadcast and keep adding to the repertoire, where we do a sort of a shorter podcast where me and John do sort of a Bible study and talk through some of this stuff as well. So keep supporting us if you want to see more of this kind of content. It'd be great to get more and more stuff like this out there. Sam, I believe that we've had a few super chats, and I believe we have some questions. Let's dive into some of those for a little while.
Yes, certainly. I'll do everything in order, because if I'm going to be going up and down, my computer will just have a little bit of a hissy fit. So we've got a question from Neil here. He says, was the firmament water above the earth, and would it protect us from solar radiation? And the second part of his question is, if that shows up, adding to my question, would the upper water firmament have fallen to earth in the flood, so exposing us to the solar radiation and causing us to age quicker, hence lifespans reduced?
Okay, now in walking with Jesus through Genesis, you got that right, Joseph. We deal with days 1 to 3, which goes from the water covering all the earth on day 1, day 2, the separation of the waters below from the waters above, and day 3, the dry land being brought up. There is no sun. Okay, so then you have a reference later on in scripture to the fountains of the deep being broken up. If you want to ponder through this, you will find several things occur. One is, on day 1, the whole earth was covered with water. On day 3, the dry land is brought up. And as I love to tell people, if you bring the inside to the outside, then the outside has to go inside. So don't be surprised from then on, what's gone inside is largely water. So don't be surprised that the amount of water we're finding trapped way underneath is not just artesian water, it's water that's way underneath, planet Earth, its inside. We do literally have huge reservoirs of water that you crack the earth again, you can get water out everywhere. And then at the end of the flood, when Noah's just sort of just getting ready to land on the mountains there, you'll find again, it says the waters retreated. And you'll find that the land was raised up yet again. Read Psalm 90 and Psalm 118 if you want some good descriptions of this in a poetic form. So you'll find the water's gone in and out, and there's some water referred to as waters above. Limitation in our discussion, there is no waters above there of great significance at the moment. So you can argue till you're blue in your face about what this absolutely meant, and then I can say, now go and check it. Well, you can't. It's not there. When we send spaceships up, they don't go through a layer of water. So we have a real limitation. We have Genesis. We have information about the day. We have Noah's life defined. We have the size of the ark defined. We have the number of animals that went there before, the number that got off, etc. But the one thing we don't have since the end of the flood is the waters above. If you want to know what theoretically waters above could have done, then yes, you would have been well protected. As I love to tell people, one of our early colleagues worked at the Mount Lucas. There's a big radiation factory down there, a big nuclear research area. He worked there. And when you have a look, we use water in radiation machinery as a big barrier. If you put sort of a meter of water around any radiation experiment, it's not going to damage you at all. It will absorb all the radiation coming off it. So water is a brilliant radiation detector, deflector, absorber. It will keep you safe. But there's one factor that people have missed. When God broke open the fountains of the deep, the water from inside that had gone down on day 3 now comes back outside. And the earth must therefore go inside. So it's not just the water coming up that's going to drown the world, it's the land coming down. But at the end of the flood, you have the land rising up and the water going down. Read Psalm 118 and Psalm 104 if you want poetic commentary on this. But do you realize one thing that's different? Who invented uranium? Who invented polonium? Who invented all of those heavy radioactive elements that we now have such controversy about on planet Earth? The answer is God, and when he did so, they were all very good. But of course, I have a suspicion that if you make a planet on day 1, day 2 and day 3, day 4 and 5 and 6, and it has to already be warm enough to keep plants growing, one day of sunlight is not going to hack it. Right, it did not get warm because of the sun coming on day 4. By day 2, day 5 and day 6, the sun for 2 days is not going to make planet Earth warm with radiation coming in. It had to have its own internal heat source. Yours truly, suspicion, and no, I can't find a verse in the Bible that says on day 3, God put uranium 27 meters under the ground. That was sufficient to actually let the heat out, but not the radioactive particles. But my suspicion is all of those radioactive elements were actually there to provide a sub-basal heating element. So you could walk around and say, oh, isn't that nice on my feet? You people in England, and particularly over there, Shelley in Canada, with her frozen feet at the moment in the ice ponds, you would love that sort of feeling coming up from the earth. And it was warm enough for all the plants to grow. The sort of thing you have to put in your greenhouse today. The world was a literal greenhouse. So it's not just the radiation that's going to come inside from outer space because the waters above has gone down. Of a far greater significance will the fact be that we now have emissions of serious radiation coming from exposed uranium. I mean, come with me. Let's go to Mary Kathleen. And Mary Kathleen, I mean, when I was young, you could wander around there, there's piles of yellow uranium oxides sitting all over the ground. We didn't understand the seriousness of this stuff, and even the rocks are radioactive. It's still great fun taking around your radio Geiger counter. We do this even at Jurassic Ark because the sand that we use over in our experiments has got low radioactivity, not enough to kill you, but enough to show the kids. But you accumulate that and you have a far more serious issue with the radiation coming from under the ground and now exposed than you would have ever had from that which is coming. Diane, you got any other comments on radiation and lifespans, etc.?
Yes, radiation is certainly one of the causes of mutations, which is damage to your genetic material. And that is one of the causes of lifespans decreasing, because your genes are being damaged by external radiation. That's one of the reasons we have to take care. Even sunlight, ultraviolet rays, to protect ourselves from those in Australia. And why in the carbon-14 laboratory, and I remember when I worked at the university, someone wanted to do some experiments using carbon-14 as a radioactive tracer, and we had to put in all sorts of extra precautions so that people didn't breathe it in. Now, the reason you don't want to breathe it in is because if it goes into your lungs, which is very close to your, there's no protection inside there. Your lungs are designed so that your the air gets as close to the blood as possible so that the oxygen can go in and the carbon dioxide can come out, whereas your skin gives you a bit more protection. But certainly radiation does cause mutations, and that certainly does cause disease and does cause limited lifespans.
I also think, just off the sort of off the back of that, the one thing that we're discovering now is prolonged exposure to even mild forms of radioactive stuff can cause long-term significant things, increasing cancers and stuff like that. So if you live, above, for instance, the Chattanooga Shale in the States, which is a radioactive rock, and we say to people when we take them on field trips there, especially to the young men, collect a sample, but don't keep it in your pocket, right? Prolonged exposure to this kind of stuff can also cause issues over the long term. So it's fine if I nip over there for a visit for a few weeks, every couple of years. But if you're living there all your life, that can cause some potentially serious problems down the line. And so I think one of the things that the flood certainly did was expose this radioactive material to the surface, and that in itself is going to affect lifespan on Earth, just because you have increased mutations, you have increased issues. No matter where you are on the planet, you're going to be either ingesting or intaking or being exposed to some form of radioactive material. And John, you briefly mentioned earlier about carbon-14. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that, because we know how it works today. We know that everybody eats this radioactive material, and therefore you become radioactive, and of course that's not going to be very good for you, and tying that into a very good world. But is there anywhere where we can use carbon-14 positively? So in terms of taking the dates and using dates and something and stuff like that. I mean, I've got a wonderful artifact here, which is a brand new one. It's a lovely oil lamp, Holy Land oil lamp. Is there a way that you can use carbon-14 for this kind of dating, as opposed to the hundreds of thousands of years dating, which we know is inaccurate?
Yeah. Well, certainly with carbon-14, when I was a student, I still remember gleefully looking at some of the research that was being done actively while I was a student. I'm sure they wouldn't be allowed to do it today, but they were sort of seeding petroleum, for the cars with carbon-14, and then driving up and down the motorways to see how much radiation actually came out, and by checking the plants alongside the highway, because plants technically take in carbon dioxide. So you have your fuel, you ignite it, you run your car, it comes out as carbon dioxide. So theoretically, it's down at the level of the plants. The plants then absorb it and should get radioactive. Well, the one thing we discovered was that was true for many of the plants, so that if you were growing a corn plant alongside, you ended up with corn with radiocarbon-14 in the corn grains. But we also discovered that some plants are so well designed, they sort of detect the difference between carbon dioxide good and carbon-14 dioxide. Did you catch how I said that? Since carbon dioxide is what's the crucial factor here, plants absorb carbon dioxide, but if it's a carbon-14, it has a different weight than ordinary carbon dioxide, and the plants just went, they would reject it. They had a carbon-14 screen. to stop that happening. So in God's eternal sovereignty, he's actually made some creatures with an ability to reject this. But if you find in the carbon-14 dating mechanisms, it soon became very evident that if carbon-14 is going to be used as a radioactive tracer, then you have to consider the time its half-life takes before it disappears. So when I was a student, it was sort of 5,700 years. Now I think it's 5,240 years, something like that, as a half-life, which technically means with the best equipment we've got today, at the most it would last for 70,000 years. We can't detect it after that. So if you detect carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone, or you detect it on that oil lamp, and I still don't have my copy of that oil lamp, Joseph, and remember mine will be the bigger one. You've been burning oil in it, and the oil had carbon in it. The carbon will have carbon-14, so traces of carbon-14 on that oil lamp, you could measure technically how long ago that lamp was used. But here's the parameter. When you look at carbon-14 on oil lamps, you get a carbon-14 date which is very young, right? So in other words, the closer you get to the present, the one thing we do know, carbon-14 becomes more and more accurate. We know that because you check it against known dates of historical influence. But if you get a dinosaur bone that's got radiation that's carbon-14 traceable, and we've seen this over and over again, you get this in many cases. There's no way the evolutionary story of vast millions of years, dinosaurs dying out at the end of the Cretaceous can be true. There should be no carbon-14 at all. And I know you ladies out there, you love wearing consolidated carbon, otherwise known as diamonds. Look, if you really want to know how old your diamond is, take it, crush it, burn it, test for carbon-14, and you'll find many diamonds have carbon-14 in. They're not eternal gifts forever. They actually are relatively young in birth and age. Is that what you're after, Joseph?
Great stuff. Yeah, thanks for that. Sam, have we got another question? I thought I saw one about days of Peleg or something, or are you going through stuff in order?
You know, it is actually in order, and that was the one.
Oh, well, there we go. Excellent.
You see, look at that. You see, we're in sync. Okay, so in Genesis 10:25, which reads, to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. The earth was divided in the time of Peleg. What is the purpose of this little passage?
You go first, Joseph, and then I'll tackle it.
All right. Well, there's two major schools of thought. The first one is that this is a reference to geology. So there's certainly evidence that at one point in Earth's history, there was one landmass. There's evidence from geology and there's evidence from scripture, because if you read in Genesis chapter 1, on day 3, it says that God gathered the water together into one place and let the dry land appear. So there was one land mass, there was one water mass. Now you can see this in geology as well. The continents all kind of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, right? Call it Pangea or Gondwana or whatever. It's a one land mass, one sea mass, and at some point they've split apart. So one school of thought says the Earth was divided in the time of Peleg, therefore this is a geological implication saying that the continents ripped apart at the time of the Tower of Babel, or soon after the time of the Tower of Babel, in the days of Peleg, as the result of, aftermath of Noah's flood. The second school of thought says that, well, the earth was divided in the time of Peleg. We know that something certainly was divided in the time of Peleg, and that was human beings. People come off of the ark, God tells them go out into all the world and multiply, and the people say, no, we're going to stay here. In fact, in defiance to make sure that we never go anywhere, we're actually going to build a tower to prove that we are just as important as God. And an interesting comment that God says is, look at the people, they have one language, they've decided to do this. Now nothing will be kept from them that they're wanting to do. And so what does God do? He comes down, he confuses their languages. 70 different people groups with 70 different languages or thereabouts they are forced to move apart from each other and to spread out into all the world, just like God had told them to do after the end of the flood, right? So the two school of thoughts, one say it's geological, the other one say it's people-based, I suppose, geographically people-based, the spreading out, the dividing up of the nations in terms of people. If you want my opinion, and I'll ask John for you to jump on the back of this, if you want to have a post-flood world where the continents get ripped apart, you need to have a second worldwide flood in order to actually do that, right? We're talking about enormous amounts of power here, enormous amounts of molten material, enormous amounts of breaking up of the Earth's crust, all the kind of things that you'd get in the middle of a global flood. So I suspect the geological one is out of the window simply because you would destroy all life on Earth just by trying to break up the continents at the time of Peleg, right, when people were alive. It certainly makes much more sense in context with the Tower of Babel that this is a description of the division of the nations, the earth in the reference to the people being divided up in the days of Peleg, and we certainly know from the genealogy that Peleg was alive at the time of the Tower of Babel. But John, any comments?
Okay, first of all, Diane, we have a couple of these type questions on the Ask site, correct?
Yes, we do, about the dispersal of the different ethnic groups and the origin of the races. So there are a couple of questions on that, yes.
So Sam, can you put up the Ask site again? Folks can go there and look at longer versions of answers for these ones you can download. And again, we'd encourage you all, like George Bond. Congratulations, George Bond. You became a subscriber in this last week to our newsletter. So I'd encourage all of you to get it. Diane looks after a lot of the editorial research for that, and you'll see comments from all of us from time to time, including questions like, what did Peleg mean, or things like that. So 2 comments from me. One is, when you look at the names in the Bible, they are meaningful compared to what you and I mean, we call someone Fred. Why did we call him Fred? Don't know, it sounded nice. My uncle was called Fred. But when you look at Peleg, his name actually means division, right? So you'll find that he was named this in his day. The world was divided. Why did Moses get his name? Because the princess of Egypt found him in the swamp. She picked him up. She drew him out, right? And so that's his name, Moses, because he was taken out of the water. When you look at John and you look at Jesus, these are all meaningful names, and they are often associated with a characteristic of the person that is going to grow from this. In some cultures, they still do this. The kids have no names for 7 to 10 years for one reason. Half of them will die anyway, so why bother naming them? And secondly, you're waiting to watch their character, and you will give them a name. He's a liar. He's a confuser. He's a lovely guy. He's Mr. Sweet, right? That's the way they'll do it. The second comment is, when you look at your Bible, can I encourage you to read it in the context of what's recorded? Okay, whilst we have many Christians arguing about, was this when the world was divided? Was this when continental drift occurred? As you read from Genesis chapter 1 to the days of Peleg, you'll find no thought of a theory called continental drift. Okay, you'll find that the first thoughts of continental drift are not the millions of years ones that we have today. Before the 1800s, you find continental drift as a thought, even with the guy who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Francis Bacon in England. He thought the continents fitted together once before the flood. Only a brief comment, never expands on it. And then in the next 200 years, all the references to continents having some sort of fitting together are all done as the world before the flood, and then divided up during the flood. Not a single person would have put the days of Peleg as related to continental drift. It's not in scripture. It's added ad hoc because we live in a world where continental drift is so popular. You try to explain the Bible in the light of it. Don't. Go to your science and use your Bible as the lens, the Bible as the set of glasses to see things through. God was there. His report is far more accurate. And Diane, they can get all of that on the website. And Sam, How are we going with donations today, mate? And tell people how they can do this, because we're looking at a Joseph up in the top screen. He's in Norfolk at the moment. He's in somebody else's room, but we need sort of funds to get his laptop really crash hot, don't we?
Absolutely.
Yes, we certainly do. Well, lucky you said that, because our good friend George Bond has wowed us with 10 Aussie buckaroos, and he's sent in saying adding towards a new laptop for Joe. So thank you very much, George, for that. God bless you. We have another donation as well from Redefined Living. He's very kindly sent us 3.99 US buckaroos. With a character exaggerately stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee
right now. Yeah.
And also we have a here we go. We've also got another exciting pair offering coffee for $4 US on this one. So God bless you both, Matt and Redefine. That's very gracious of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I'm just checking to see if we've had any other donations. No, it doesn't look like it. However, one thing I will mention, actually two things we can mention whilst we're having a little bit of a 30-second break in between questions, is we have Twitter. You can see it here. There you go. That's us on Twitter. Follow the Creation Guy. I think we've got a graphic actually for Twitter, have we, or did we take it off?
It might be still up there. Let's have a look.
If it's still there, whack it on.
What have we got? We've got that. Is that that's the podcast?
No, that's we're available as a podcast as well.
Well, yeah, as well as that. There you go.
Yeah,
podcast.
There you go.
There you go.
But yeah, if you go to Twitter and just type in @TheCreationGuy, you should be able to find us. Titled as Creation Research. Trying to populate some content on there, experimenting with what works, what doesn't. So let us know what you think, what you want to see from the Twitter, and we can see if we can make that happen. As well, also we have launched a merchandise store, so you can grab some really sweet swag. I mean, look at this. I mean, who wants to wear Batman? I mean, we want to wear Creation Research, on your T-shirt. I mean, I can't because that'd just be bias if I bought one. But if you bought one, it would really help out the ministry, and help us with some funds. And sorry, what? I don't have a shirt. I have to make some up. Anyway, but yeah, if you go to https://creationresearch.myspreadshop.co.uk, and if you go there in the next 7 days and you place an order, you get 15% off. So that's not to be sniffed at. So you help us, you help yourself, you get some sweet swag. Talk to your friends, tell them about us, get them to come and watch, and so that's the DEO at the minute. We've got lots of different things. We've got hoodies, T-shirts, mugs, cups.
I'm assuming, Sam, that the new word there that you invented called merch has a longer meaning. Is that merchandise?
Yeah, merchandise, or it's known as another word called swag. Swag is another word that's used. Yeah, okay. But the typical abbreviated term is merch.
Now I can see how the Tower of Babel happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds all right.
Good stuff.
We do have one or two more questions, I believe.
Great stuff.
To make sure I haven't moved anything.
Hello to a. Sorry, go on.
From Redefined Living. Are you suggesting that if Adam was made after the coffee break, he might not have sinned? So that's quite funny. What are you going to say, Joe?
I was just going to say hello to a new viewer. We've had a new viewer as well. Just put that up. New to the channel and organization, has been enjoying the conversation. So, yeah, great stuff. Thanks for joining us. Continue to join us. We're here every single week at 9 p.m. UK time, or whatever that is around the world. That's why I start with good morning, good evening, good afternoon, because who knows where or when you are watching us. So it's sort of very early in the morning for John and Diane. It's late at night here, and it's probably afternoon time in the States anyway. So good to see you. Keep following and watching.
And I notice we have some viewers from Texas. So welcome you all down there. and great to
Howdy.
see you.
Howdy,
Blimey.
partner.
Yeah, that's the way it goes too. I watched that movie as well. They didn't use the term nerd. Okay, any other questions there, Sam?
Right. Okay.
There's one from Jim P. I can see. Yeah.
Jim P. Yes, I can see it here. Here we go. Right. Okay, got it. I think this is the one.
Oh, that's a good point, actually. There, yeah. This is a quote from the verse a little bit further down, where it says, "These are the families of the sons of Noah, their generations in their nations, and these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." So certainly in context to the reference to the days of Peleg, it's talking about people, and context is extremely important when you're looking through scripture as well. So that's a great point there, Jim.
It's not really a question, though. It's a good comment, because there's no doubt about it that both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the people on planet Earth are always regarded as descendants of the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And Ham, of course, he's come up in our discussions on races, right? So that Ham is Hebrew for hot, or actually it's Egyptian for hot, and it became the Hebrew for dark, because the Hamites went to Egypt. It's even a word they call themselves in Egypt. And the Shemites are the descendants of Shem, who basically in the end become the people of Israel. And then the Japhethites are the people who become people that look like Joseph and me and Sam and Diane, the European type, Greek type, the white-skinned Mediterranean type of people. And all of the nations on the earth are descended from those three after the generations in these nations, right? They were already on the edge of sort of splitting up when you had the big Tower of Babel, and they get split up because they politically refused to obey God.
Great stuff. Did I see a question from George come through a little while back?
Yes, you did.
Yeah,
I managed to find it whilst you were explaining.
There we go. Great stuff.
And delightful point. There we go. So George says, why didn't the super heavy elements, he said super heavy elements, sink
Emphasis
to the
on
Earth's core? So it's super. A bit like my Batman t-shirt, where you can get some Creation Research merch at our Creation Research store. Sorry, that's just a horrible plug. I'm trying to get some traction on this, trying to get it. Anyway, why didn't the super heavy elements sink to the Earth's core like the iron and nickel if the Earth was a molten ball of rock for 500 million years?
I'll throw in one comment, then Joseph can take over, or Diane, whoever wants to come next. Have you kept up with the latest theories of what's inside the Earth? You do have to realize that we don't know. I mean, we've been down caves. I've been down Mount Isa mines. There's one big mine there that you go down. It's way below the surface, and you can't stay there for more than a couple of minutes. It is so hot. There's a volcanic section just beside it, and you sweat labilio. That's an Australian word there, Sam, if you need a new word for your merch store. You sweat like crazy. And the deeper you go, the theory used to be the hotter the Earth would get. But of course, what we've done, we've drilled holes now down 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 15 miles even, and that theory does not work out. Some places get cooler, some places get hotter. We have got nowhere near the center of the Earth. So we do not know from observation what the center of the Earth is like. You know, the nice picture you see of onion shells in the earth in your high school textbook, that's an interpretation of earthquake waves. You bounce, you have an earthquake, say in Indonesia, and the shock waves travel around the earth, bounce off the edges back through, and you interpret those to be, it changes velocity and direction at this spot, so there must be a shell, a change in density there. But in the latest theory, the earth is not a hot molten iron core. As to what it is, your guess is as good as mine. So, George, perhaps the question needs to change a bit. Joseph, take over. What would you answer to that question at the moment?
I mean, certainly, it's a certainly very valid point if you take the sort of, you could call it standard interpretation of, iron or nickel sort of solid inner core and then an outer core and so on and so forth up to the mantle, it is a valid point. Over millions of years, you should have the super heavy elements sink down to the bottom, and they seem to be evenly distributed. So it's a good point if you take that standard interpretation. It's a similar kind of issue to when you're looking at like the distant starlight problem. Right, you look at an Andromeda galaxy, which is 25 odd million light years away. Well, how did it reach us in 6,000 years? Well, it's a valid point if you take the standard interpretation of how light travels, or you take the assumption that light has always traveled in the same way. Of course, the evolutionists have a similar problem to our standard time starlight problem, and it's linked to this sort of super heavy elements in Earth's molten core, because one thing you'll find is that matter and energy appears to be evenly distributed throughout the universe, and there simply hasn't been enough time, even in 15.5 billion years or however long the universe is supposed to be now, to actually do that naturally. It's a similar issue with our molten Earth scenario. But you realize that all of these rely on two major things. The first one is they're all assumptions based around the latest thinking in science, and even the latest thinking in science is based on an assumption itself. So it's an assumption based on an assumption. And all of a sudden you realize, well, hang on a minute, we don't actually know very much about what the Earth inside looks like. There's a brand new idea about the inside of the Earth. Who knows? It may even be a hollow core, although I doubt it. But it's a similar kind of scenario with distant starlights. All of this stuff is based off of assumptions that Einstein came up with, but half of those were based off of assumptions that we never really were able to prove. And now physicists, particularly computer scientists, are starting to think, well, if we think outside the box and we say that maybe light can be slowed down, maybe light can be sped up, maybe there are things that we don't fully understand, maybe we need to stop making these assumptions in this way, all of a sudden so many different possibilities get opened up to you. So it's a very valid point if you want to sort of go down the standard assumptions based in what we believe or what scientists or one particular model says about the inside of Earth, but just be wary of building your own defense points on assumptions that are built on assumptions in the first place, because you just end up going round and round in circles. Any other comments, guys?
I did notice before, Sam, there was a question about owls and seeds and post-flood. Can you hunt that question down? Because I thought at the time we do need to deal with that because it relates to the word seed particularly.
So I'm on it.
Well,
in the meantime, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, so like just on the question that George has asked, as well as like what you two have said. We know that going into the Earth, we know it gets hotter because we can see that and test that, repeat that. That's for certain. So could it be argued also that if we were to drill down far enough, would we possibly see hell?
This was a very popular theory about 10 years ago, until we began to discover, as I said, that there are some places where you drill down, it gets hotter. There are other places where you drill down and it doesn't, right? So it is not a universal fact that increases in temperature as you get lower down. So it forced a rethinking of so many areas. But the thing that brought this was they drilled a hole 15 kilometers deep, and when they listened, they heard screaming, right? Now that is Facebook fiction. It deserves one of those COVID negative type stickers, false fact. It's simply not true. So you would not find hell. Hell is not a location in terms of the center of the earth, no matter what Mr. Dante and some of the others theorized back in the 1500s in their Catholic misdirected theology. So you find hell is very real and it's eternal and it's a terrible place. And the most terrible part of it is if you take the story of Jesus and the wealthy man who dies and goes to hell, and Lazarus who ends up with Abraham in paradise and now in heaven, the rich man can see what he's missed out on. That will be the worst part of being in hell. You'll be able to visualize, see actually all the glories of heaven, and never be able to get to them. So hell's very real. Avoid it only through Jesus Christ. No other way, no religion, no methodology outside of Christ will get you out of the judgment on your sin.
And a final quick interesting comment is that this kind of bad theology, if you like, from the sort of 1500s that visualized hell being a place on earth, in a sense, inspired the writers that ended up conjuring the steampunk style stuff of Jules Verne and the like, when they do the journey to the center of the earth and they pass through a weird mix of evolution and through time and past peoples and hell, and all these sort of strange ideas actually were built off of these sort of 1500s, 14th century, 16th century philosophers of religion, in a sense. So it's interesting how history kind of ties together and how there's nothing new under the sun as well. But
okay, bring up the one on the owl, Sam.
I've hunted it down. I have caught the owl. Here we go. Birds spread out the seeds is the initial part here from Jim P. And he goes on to say in Genesis 7:3, of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. Is that what you're on about?
That's the one we're on about. And there was another question about seeds on the earth. So Diane, would you like to comment on the meaning of why God is picking sevens here and what the comment seed means here in Old English?
Well, seed in Old English has a wider term than just plants. It refers to propagation in general. So that's from the King James Version, of fowls of the air by sevens, the male and the female, to keep their seed or seed alive on the earth. In other words, to enable them to reproduce. Because we talk about in Genesis the seed of the woman and the seed of the man, meaning the reproductive cells. So in older English, it was a general term for reproduction. So in that context, that's what it meant, that the animals and birds on the ark were going to be saved in order to propagate after after the flood. The bit about birds spreading seeds, well, that is true, but it doesn't account for the grass and other plants that spring up after floods and after droughts in Australia. We can study that, but anyway, you will observe that a little bit more than I will, John, having lived out in some of the where there are very long periods of drought in the outback of Australia.
It's certainly true that when you look at the world after the flood, the people get to choose where they go to or get directed by God at judgment. But the plants that grew up in the areas, we need to recognize the distribution of the seeds during the flood would have been by water, right? So any seeds floating around being buried in the mud would have been almost by, you could say, random processes. So the fact that there are gum trees in Australia is not because they've evolved here. Some of the seeds would have landed here and they've been propagated here because we find fossil gum trees in New Zealand. We find them in other countries as well. They've survived here. So propagation of many plants after the flood was by flood distribution initially. So this ended up there, this ended up here, and you and I think of them as indigenous to the area. No, some of them are indigenous by natural selection. They've been eliminated on the rest of the planet. But we have some areas in Australia where we know they are plants that were taken there by birds, because only birds distribute their seeds. But the areas become so isolated in Central Australia, there are no birds living there that shift their seeds around anymore, right? So the environment has eliminated the very means that could have got them there. So it's a remnant environment, right? And evidence that climate used to be much better and life's animal would have been much widespread. Australia would have been a lovely place straight after Noah's flood, with plants galore, animals that could have propagated as easily as one thing, and propagation methods that now simply can't occur because the animals and birds have been eliminated.
Great stuff. I think we've got one more question, which we should just be able to sneak in, and we've had a few more donations, so we'll bring them up as well. And then I think it's about time to wrap things up. A reminder that we will be putting out our first ever news broadcast, which will be going out in about half an hour's time. So keep an eye out for that if you're able to stay awake in the UK or in Australia and the USA, then you're on pretty good time for that. So watch that and enjoy that. I'll just very quickly play the little brief preview that we put up earlier because we've had some more people and newer people watch. So this is what's coming up in about half an hour time, a brand new broadcast from Creation Research. Hello and welcome to Creation Research News, a brand new broadcast from Creation Research. The headlines today: a rich diversity of fossils from the dead heart of Australia. Black box to record humanity's end. Keratin socks it to evolution. Giant millipedes once roamed northern England, and Darwin's abominable mystery solved yet again. So be sure to get behind and support the project, enjoy the news as it comes out, and enjoy them as they keep coming out as well over the next few weeks and year, and hopefully it's a regular feature here on the YouTube channel. Sam, how have we got with the last questions and those donation things?
Right, okay, so I've got the donations here ready to go. We've had £10 from Neil Grindley of 10 British buckaroos, so thank you, God bless you for that. And we've also had 10 US buckaroos from Brother Timothy. So he says, God bless brothers and sister. God bless you. Thank you so much for your generosity. And one final donation, if my computer decides to actually click on it. This has come from Keith Colvin for another 10 US buckaroos. You guys are terrific. God bless your ministry. No, God bless you. This ministry couldn't survive without you. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. Do we have that final question? And then let's wrap it up for the night.
Simply do. This has come in from Neil Grindley, and he says, was the Tower of Babel waterproof so to escape a second flood, recognizing their own rebellion by building it?
Diane, what do you reckon the comment on waterproofing's got to do with the use of bitumen and that?
It's an interesting idea. Certainly, bitumen. They knew about bitumen. They knew about firing bricks. Their building materials were very sophisticated, actually. After all, remember, this is the generation that has been close to Noah and Shem and the immediate descendants of Noah's three sons. So a lot of that knowledge would have been passed off. So it's quite possible that the Tower of Babel was waterproof. I don't think it would have protected them from a second worldwide flood, but then God had promised that there wouldn't be a second worldwide flood, because that was one of the promises he made to Noah. As long as the earth endures, he's not going to destroy the world by a flood anymore. There will be regular patterns and cycles. So I'm sure the Tower of Babel was a very sophisticated building, because there was a lot of knowledge there and a lot of sophisticated building techniques. But it wouldn't have escaped a second worldwide flood, but then there was no need for it. But I'm sure it was a very clever building.
Okay, when I was a Christian, just become one, I got an old Bible with an archaeological supplement in it. And there it had a lovely photograph in black and white. For those of you who, in the modern generation, that's all we ever saw. No color pictures, right? Black and white from the late 1800s of an enormous square just on the edge of Babylon, right? And it was called the basement of the Tower of Babel. And the explanation was the locals had been stealing bricks forever and a day to rebuild their own things. Now, the Brits couldn't complain about that. If you look at my ancestral castles, or so many ancestral castles, the castle is gone. It's now the bricks in the houses down the hill. we borrow bricks and we shift them. And so the locals had been gradually destroying the Tower of Babel. But what's interesting is having Google Earth these days, go to Google Earth and search Tower of Babel. It's there and it's marked, a huge big hole in the ground, and it's the bottom layer where they put, I mean, the bricks went down, and there was a huge foundation. So it was high-tech stuff. And then not far away on the edge of the river is one of the biggest sources of bitumen on the planet. So don't be surprised that they could actually use bitumen to glue the bricks together. And that bitumen, well, before Noah's flood, he used bitumen made from pine trees that he exuded the gum out of, mixed it with black carbon, and it produced a sticky, waterproof substance. They didn't need to do that after the flood because the flood had cooked all of the sort of pine trees, dumped them in watery mud, squashed them, exuded the stuff out, heated it up by pressure, and it produces bitumen. Ooey gooey, black, oozy stuff, right? And they scooped it out and they coated their bricks with it, and they actually used it as a glue. So scientifically, archaeologically, and historically, you'll find it still there. Go search it on Google Earth and look it up for yourself. God's word is true right from the beginning. And if you look hard enough and long enough, you'll find the evidence, which is why the New Testament says, test everything. Only keep the things that are true. God is not scared of you checking anything out in his whole scripture. And that's what creation research is about. That's what our program's about, eh, Joseph and Sam?
Amen. Amen. Absolutely. Well, that rounds us off quite nicely. Thank you all very much for those who are still watching. We've still got a good number of people watching, so that's great. Thank you all for everybody who joined us, and be sure to join us next week as we have a special Q&A program. So again, any questions we haven't got to, we will deal with them as well from the past streams, and any questions you put in the comments as well. We do keep a monitor on them, so please stick your questions into the comments and we will come round to them next week in our Q&A special. Thank you for that, Sam. Remind us again what that's all about. You're muted, Sam.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. That's better.
Sorry. If you want some sweet merch or whatever John said, that you can grab some with 15% off if you follow that link. That's https://creationresearch.myspreadshop.co.uk. We ship worldwide. Items are slightly more expensive than what you would probably expect. However, that does help our ministry. And you are buying quality product when you buy it through a Spreadshirt. So not to worry, you are in safe hands and you're helping the ministry and you get a cool piece of clothing. So what's not to love?
Great stuff as well. Be sure to watch the news broadcast which is going out. Give us some feedback on that. We've got some ideas of developing that in the future. The next one will be out in a couple of weeks time, or whenever the next Creation Evidence news comes out. Make sure you are signed up to the email evidence news that comes out, because that's what we base these broadcasts on. So hopefully that will be fun for you to watch and some more information there, but that will obviously go up and stay up. So watch that, give us some feedback. Thank you all very much for joining us. John and Diane, any last words from you?
No, just farewell. I'll go and look after my poor sick wife.
Yes, thank you for joining us, and do come back.
Absolutely. Goodbye. God bless. We'll catch you later, everyone.
See ya.